She never stops criticizing me. Why am I always wrong? No matter what I do, she finds something wrong. I wash the dishes. She says I did it wrong. I try to help. She says I never listen. Even small things somehow turn into criticism. At first, it may seem just like small comments, but after a while, something strange starts happening inside a man. You begin thinking more carefully about every little action. You start replaying conversations in your head. You start wondering if you said something the wrong way. And slowly, almost without noticing it, you begin to feel like you are constantly being evaluated. And when that happens long enough, a man starts losing something very important: respect. Not just respect from the partner, but the feeling of being respected in the relationship. But here's the strange part. In many relationships, where criticism becomes constant, the real problem is not the criticism itself. What looks like criticism on the surface is often just a symptom of a deeper dynamic forming between two people. And if that dynamic is not understood, both partners usually keep repeating the same reactions again and again without actually changing the situation. So, in this video, we are going to break down what is really happening here, why constant criticism appears in relationships, why many men respond to it in ways that unintentionally make it worse, and what actually begins to change the interaction pattern between two people. And at the end of this video, I'll also show you how you can explore your own relationship situation deeper inside the full case breakdown library, including the option to submit one situation for analysis completely free. But first, let's break down this case together. The case. Recently, someone wrote me with a situation that many men quietly recognize. He said something very simple. No matter what I do, she criticizes me. Even small things. I try to help, I try to listen, but somehow it always feels like it's not enough. And then he added something that I hear very often in situations like this. He said, honestly, it's starting to destroy my confidence. Now, here's the important part. Situations like this usually don't start with big fights. They don't start with dramatic conflicts. Most of the time, they begin with small things, small corrections, small comments, small frustrations. Maybe she says something like, why did you do it like that? Or, I already told you how to do this. Or, you never really listen. Individually, none of these moments seems like a big deal. But, over time, something subtle begins to change in the relationship. At first, it feels like feedback, but slowly, the dynamic shifts from cooperation into correction. When that shift happens, both partners often start reacting in ways that reinforce the pattern without realizing it. What it feels like for a man. Now, let's talk about what this situation usually feels like from the inside. Because most men don't immediately see a relationship dynamic. At the beginning, they simply try to improve things. They think, okay, maybe I shall do this better next time. I'll remember. Alright, I'll change it. And often, they genuinely try. They try to help more. They try to listen more. They try to avoid repeating mistakes. But slowly something begins to change internally. Instead of feeling appreciated for the effort, a man starts feeling evaluated. And after enough of these moments, many men quietly begin saying something to themselves. Something they really say out loud. It feels like I'm always doing something wrong. That sentence appears surprisingly often in conversations with men in this situation, because over time the emotional experience shifts. Instead of feeling like a partner, a man begins to feel like a student, constantly being graded. And when that feelings become strong enough, men usually start reacting in a few predictable ways. Not because they are trying to create problems, but because they're trying to protect themselves inside the situation. And those reactions are exactly what we are going to look at next. The four types of men in this situation. When a man starts feeling constantly criticized in a relationship, he usually tries to handle it somehow. But interestingly, most men don't react to this situation in completely random ways. Over time, certain patterns begin to appear, and many men move between a few typical reactions. Let's look at four of the most common ones. Type 1, the fixer. This is often the first reaction. The man believes, if I just do things better, the criticism will stop. So he starts adjusting. He tries to remember every detail. He tries to improve the way he does things. He listens more carefully. He makes an effort. And for a while, this feels like the responsible thing to do. But slowly, a subtle dynamic begins to form. She evaluates. He corrects himself. She notices another issue. He tries to improve again. And over time, the relationship starts feeling less like cooperation and more like constant performance. Type 2, the defender. Another common reaction is to start explaining everything. A man hears criticism and immediately wants to clarify the situation. For example, she says, "You forgot again." He answers, "I didn't forget, I was busy." She says, "You always say that." He replies, "Because it's true." And very quickly, the conversation turns into an argument. Both people start defending their positions, and instead of understanding each other, they end up reinforcing the conflict. Type 3, the withdrawer. At some point, many men get tired of arguing, so they choose a different strategy. They stop reacting. They say things like, "Okay, fine, whatever." They avoid the discussion, not because they don't care, but because they feel like nothing they say will change the situation. But from the other side, this often feels very different. Instead of seeing a man trying to avoid conflict, the partner experiences emotional distance, and the criticism may increase even more. Type 4, the reactor. And then there is another pattern that appears in many relationships. The man stays quiet for a long time. He observes small criticism again and again. He tries to stay calm. He tries not to create conflict. But eventually, the tension builds up, and one day, he suddenly explodes. He says something like, "Why are you always attacking me?" Or, "I'm tired of this." From his perspective, the frustration has been building for a week or months. But from her perspective, the reaction looks sudden and disproportionate. Conclusion: most men move between these four reactions. Sometimes they try to fix the situation. Sometimes they defend themselves. Sometimes they withdraw. And sometimes they explode. But here's the important insight: none of these reactions actually change the dynamic of the relationship. And that's why the same patterns keeps repeating. Frame shift. So, if reacting in this way does not really change the situation, then what's actually going on here? To really understand this dynamic, we need to look at the situation from a deeper perspective. And one helpful way to do that is to examine it on three different levels, because what we see on the surface is often only a small part of the real picture. The three levels of understanding. Let's start with the first level, the surface level. At the surface level, the situation seems quite simple. A man sees a partner who criticizes many things. Maybe she points out small mistakes. Maybe she corrects the way he does something. Maybe she says things like, "Why did you do it like that?" Or, "I already told you how to do this." From this perspective, the conclusion seems obvious. She criticizes everything. And naturally, the focus becomes the specific behavior. The dishes, the timing, the way something was said, the details of everyday situations. But if we stay only at this level, we miss something important. Because constant criticism rarely comes only from the small things themselves. At a deeper level, criticism is often connected to emotional experiences underneath. Sometimes there is frustration. Sometimes there is a feeling of not being heard. Sometimes there is emotional loneliness inside the relationship. But instead of expressing those feelings directly, they often come out in a different form. Instead of saying, "I feel alone in this relationship," a partner might say, "Why did you do this wrong again?" Instead of saying, "I need more connection," it may come out as, "You never listen." So, the criticism we hear on the surface may actually be an indirect expression of something deeper, the systemic level. And then is the deepest level, the level of relationship dynamics. At this level, something interesting begins to appear. Over time, repeated interactions start forming a pattern. One partner criticizes, the other partner defends, or withdraws, or tries to fix things, and each of those reactions reinforces the pattern. Criticism leads to defense, defense leads to more criticism, withdrawal leads to frustration, frustration leads to more criticism, and gradually the relationship settles into a kind of structure, a system of roles. One person becomes a critic, the other person becomes the one who is constantly responding. And once this pattern forms, every new interaction tends to reinforce it, even when both people actually want the relationship to improve. Five early signals the dynamic is forming. Now, here's something important. Relationship dynamics rarely appear suddenly. They usually form slowly, through small repeated interactions. And there are often early signals that the pattern is starting to form. Let's look at five of the most common ones. Signal 1. Correction becomes the more frequent than appreciation. In healthy dynamics, people notice both positive and negative things. But when this pattern begins forming, something shifts. Corrections become more common than appreciation. Instead of hearing, "Thanks for doing that," you hear, "You forgot this." Instead of, "I appreciate the effort," you hear, "Next time do it differently." And over time, the emotional balance changes. The relationship begins to feel more like evaluation than partnership. Signal 2. Conversations focus mostly on what is wrong. Another signal appears in everyday conversations. Topics increasingly revolve around problems. What was not done? What could be better? What should have happened? Even natural situations slowly turn into discussions about mistakes. And when this becomes the dominant tone of communication, tension starts building under the surface. Signal 3. As the partner constantly explains themselves. This one is very recognizable. One partner starts explaining the actions again and again. Why something happened, why something was forgotten, why something was done a certain way. And slowly, the conversation starts sounding less like dialogue and more like justification. almost like someone trying to defend their position. Signal 4. Emotional distance quietly grows. When criticism becomes frequent, many people start protecting themselves emotionally. They speak less openly, they avoid certain topics, they become more careful with their words. On the outside, the relationship may still function normally, but inside, a subtle emotional distance begins to grow. Signal 5. Respect begins to feel fragile. And this is perhaps the most important signal. Respect starts feeling unstable. A man begins wondering, am I actually respected here? And once that question appears inside a relationship, the emotional foundation becomes much fragile. And when these signals appear, the more important question is no longer who is right. The real question becomes something different. How do we change the interaction pattern between two people? What actually starts changing the dynamic? Now, this is where many men make a very understandable mistake. Most men focus on trying to stop the criticism. They think, if I explain better, if I argue better, if I prove my point, then the criticism will stop. But interestingly, real change in this dynamic usually begins somewhere else. It begins with changing the interaction pattern itself, and that usually starts with three important shifts. Shift 1. Stop automatic reactions. The first step is surprisingly simple. Stop reacting automatically. When criticism appears, many people immediately jump into one of the four reactions we talked about earlier. They defend, they explain, they withdraw, or they explode. But the moment a person pauses and observes the pattern, instead of reacting immediately, something important begins to change because awareness breaks automatic cycles. Shift 2. Rebuild internal stability. The second shift is internal. When criticism becomes frequent, many men slowly begin tying their confidence to the partner's reactions. If she approves, things feel good. If she criticizes, confidence drops. But long term stability in relationships cannot depend on every emotional reaction from the other person. A man needs an internal sense of stability that is not constantly shaken by every comment. And when that stability returns, the whole interaction dynamic often begins shifting naturally. Shift 3. Change the interaction style. And the third shift is about how conversations happen. Instead of immediately defending or explaining, the interaction style becomes calmer and more grounded. For example, instead of reacting with, that is not true, I did it, a man might respond with something like, okay, I hear that this bothered you. Let's look at what actually happened. Or, I'm open to hearing what matters to you here, but constant criticism is not helping us solve it. The goal is not to win the argument. The goal is to change the tone and structure of the interaction itself. And when that begins to happen, the relationship dynamic often starts shifting as well. Core philosophy. Now, let's step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Relationships are not just about you, and they not just about your partner. They are about the space created between two people. That space is alive. It has its own dynamics. And the way you interact inside that space, consciously or unconsciously, shape the relationship itself. Because I plus you equal we. When the dynamic inside that space changes, the relationship can change too. This is why understanding patterns is so powerful. Because once you see the space clearly, you start realizing what you can actually influence. Not by controlling, not by pleasing, but by showing up fully in yourself. And that's the kind of change that lasts. Some relationship situations are simple. A small adjustment here or there fixes them. But others need deeper analysis. They are layered, subtle, and often hidden beneath surface behaviors. That's why we created the full case breakdown library. Inside, you can explore deeper relationship dynamics, watch detailed analysis of real cases, and submit your own situation for a personal breakdown. And as I promised, here's a bonus. You can submit one case for analysis completely free. No catch, just clarity. Plus, there is a private discussion space where you can connect with other men working on the same challenges. It's not about finding a quick fix, it's about deeper understanding, practicing, and growing together. Sometimes the biggest change in a relationship begins with one simple thing: seeing clearly what's actually happening between two people.